All right, welcome again to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the beat and pour white lightning straight onto your brain. What are we talking about today, Samo?
This episode, you wanted to talk about the shootings in Washington, and I'm
Yeah.
assuming it's the two Israelis outside of the
hmm
museum. And so I'm going to go into some uh, psychological concepts on propaganda and how that can work to radicalize an individual. And you've got some other philosophical stuff to add to that.
Yeah, and I teased this previously that I wanted to try and establish a baseline of moral philosophy before we get into the specifics, because during the summer we're going to be reading Dostoevsky and talking about him, which is that's what he's all about is establishing a moral framework and why and how. Um, but for a couple of reasons, I've this I mean really hit me this morning, and I was like, you know what, I wasn't sure we'd have time, that I'd have time, because sun's out, guns out. I've got gardening cred I've got to get done. But as I was running out to uh, get stuff, I've got some Jewish neighbors, and they do the Sabbath in at their home. So there's always a big crowd of cars around their house on Saturday, and they have armed private security outside right now.
Hmm.
And we are sitting here in the suburbs of North Dallas, in a well-to-do area where you have a generally low crime rate, but it is a reasonable precaution. It is a more than reasonable precaution. And the fact that they have to do that makes me seethe. And it reminded me that this is not the first time I have seen armed private security outside their house. And the first time they had to do this was a week or two after October 7th for what looked like a child's birthday party. And that was depressing.
Well, and this is okay. So I wasn't going to go this way, but if you want to talk about narcissistic behavior, and I'm going to say as a whole, we talk about corporate psychopathy. I'm going to say the government is the narcissist. It
Mm,
is the abusive husband or the abusive
mm,
wife. The acronym is FOG: fear, obligation, and guilt, to make you do what they want you to do. And we're seeing that fear show up a lot. And whether that's, I mean, it's a form of control. These people are scared. So now all that has to happen is the government swoop in and say, I will protect you. Right. And yeah, put a pin in that for later in the conversation. But yeah, just remember the acronym FOG.
the other reason I was already kind of on tilt is just scrolling through X when this story happened. And I just happened to be scrolling through while I was watching some stuff on YouTube, and I saw the first reports of it. And then as more information came out, and then when the pictures came out, and this young couple, and part of the reports was that he had just earlier that week bought a ring and was planning to propose to her when they went back to Israel
Hmm.
in a few weeks. And I have a young son and a young daughter-in-law around this same age, early 20s. This couple looked to be mid to late 20s, you know, and that hit hard because it made it personal. Um, but it's also another, you know, how many times over the past several years have we said something to the effect of this shouldn't happen here? Meaning, this isn't the kind of thing that happens in America. At least we
Mhm.
don't think it does. You go back to the 60s and 70s and some of the radicalism and violence there, and we're not that far removed from violence of this sort, just targeted at different groups. And it also reminded me of something. I haven't talked about this yet because there was a slim chance that I could get called for the jury pool.
Mm.
But it's been long enough, and I just recently got called to jury duty. I think I can talk about this. It's not going to happen. So the stabbing at the track meet that happened in Texas, the kid that was arrested went to the high school my children graduated from. And in thinking about it and in talking about it with my wife, not that long ago, we were both kind of ranting about hooliganism.
Mm.
Middle school aged kids who were doing increasingly violent things, but it was kind of shrugged off as kids will be kids. Well, no, you're doing you're doing enough property damage now. You are getting into felony territory here.
Hmm.
This is no longer just misdemeanor throwing eggs at someone's house. Okay,
Yeah,
this
or
is
what
like
what me and I'm not going to name the friends, but me and some friends did in high school, which was called phreaking, phone phreaking. Back in the day when you had landlines, we would go to the terminals for the landlines and hack into people's phones and call 1-900 numbers. And so some people got on their bills, and hopefully we didn't break up any marriages in hindsight, where there was sex talk lines that were called from their landline, which shows up on your bill because it would have been like $2 a minute or whatever
yeah.
they do. So yeah, so we that was that's technically vandalism. So
Yeah.
you know,
And the point being, this this perpetrator in this stabbing, he would have been about in middle school at that time. And
mhm,
my rant to my wife about this was there is a theory of law enforcement called the broken windows theory, which is
yeah.
you attack
It's not a
you
theory. It's
yeah,
okay. So we're going to use it actually the correct form of theory, which the
not
alternate,
hypothesis.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the alternate explanations have not been able to counter it
Hmm.
to any extent. Yeah.
So this is what Rudy Giuliani did in the 90s to turn New York City into a family attraction. It became a family tourist destination. Whereas in the 70s and 80s, you didn't go there,
Hmm.
or you only went to certain, like you go to the Statue of Liberty. You did not go to Times Square because it was full of junkies and hookers. Okay. So what he did is he took this because he was a federal prosecutor. He took this idea, and the idea is you don't let the small stuff go. You don't just shrug and say kids will be kids. No, no. You prosecute. You
Hmm.
investigate and prosecute the small stuff so that it does not turn into big stuff.
Let me kind of put broken window theory into layman's terms for anybody that isn't familiar. If uh, it was a concept created with what they were trying to parse out was, do places have more broken windows because crime is higher, or do overt signs of high crime create more crime? And
Mhm.
they were able to figure out that actually, if there are signs of higher crime in that area, people will be more likely to create more crime. So we're looking
Mhm.
at causation versus correlation, and they were actually able to figure out that there is a causal effect. When it looks like it's okay to do this here, more people will do it. And that's the concept that's pretty universal. Let's look at a something that most people don't realize is more wives beat their husbands than husbands beat their wives. Why? Because it's okay. It's just as simple as that. So when people think it's okay for me to do it, they're more likely to do it. And if you're in a place that looks like, hey, it's okay for me to do this here, then you're more likely to do it. And when it comes to really violent crime, then we've got a big problem, a whole societal problem.
And how does this connect here to what just happened is before we started recording, you called him a kid. And he is mentally, because we have a bunch of adult children nowadays,
What was his age?
30.
Okay, yeah, then
The reports I've read were 30. Okay. But I believe he went to grad school for something. from the University of Chicago is what I've seen, that he was from Chicago, and I believe he attended the University of Chicago, both undergraduate and graduate. I don't know for what. I didn't find that. But the point being, how many years have, well, go back to where this channel first started, is you were mostly apolitical. You had your own ideological leanings, but generally speaking, you were apolitical.
Hmm.
Is you didn't care about politics. You didn't follow it, like I did. Um,
Well, what I
as
like to tell people is I used to leave politics alone, but politics wouldn't leave me alone.
exactly. And you started saying, what in the world is going on? The country is losing its mind. And you actually looked into critical theory,
Hmm.
their own words, their
Which I
own
had to learn a new
textbooks.
language for, basically.
Exactly.
You know.
And the point being, what you were bringing up is, look, this has been going on for years, and it is in academia. And so now, when you look at what's going on college campuses, especially since October 7th, since we are talking about a targeted attack of an ethnic group, which is what this was, well, it's
Mm.
justifiable. Don't take that out of context, but it is illogical because it is based on a bunch of fallacies. But if you take the underlying assumptions and don't analyze them, take them as true, then what this person did is rational. The math club shooter. If Trump is literally Hitler, what he did was rational. Now it's completely illogical because, for crying out freaking loud, on its face, the statement that Trump is literally Hitler is stupid. Besides being wrong, it's just stupid. But if you accept that, well, then that is going to lead you to the next step, the next step, the next step. So for years, there has been no pushback against this. And now you have a large swath of young people, and I lump this guy in there because we're talking teens to 30 years old, who have been inculcated in this doctrine, in this ideology, and it has completely radicalized them. And
It,
so that is what I
you
wanted to focus on with the discussion of moral philosophy
well, no,
today
no.
is,
Let's go with let's start with his college education.
okay.
Because I'm looking at a profile of him by NBC News here. Uh, he was a he worked for the American. Let me bring it up on the screen. The American Osteopathic Information Association. And remember when I brought up the AMA? We need to control
Mm-hmm.
the narrative stuff.
Mm-hmm.
As a physician, organization, so he was a physician apparently,
Holy
dedicated
crap.
to protecting the health and sanctity of human life. We believe in the rights of all persons to live safely without fear of violence. So obviously he took that uh, to heart when it came to the Palestinian people. And what I was reading in that article, he actually had a sign for, apparently there was a young Palestinian kid that was stabbed by their landlord in Illinois.
Hmm.
So, and that was in reference to that. So we've got a little bit of back and forth tit for tat going on here.
One of the many horrible things about this shooting is that uh they were Israeli, so ethnically they were Jewish, but they were Christians.
Mm.
They weren't even religious Jews.
So
But
he was
that's
profiling.
that's part of the point, is to this
Yeah.
person and people like him that didn't matter.
Hmm.
Um, another horror that is hard to stomach, but I think it needs to be pointed out to illustrate how depraved this was, is according to multiple reports I read, The young woman was not killed immediately.
No, she died in the hospital. Yeah.
She was according to several eyewitnesses, she was crawling away and he walked towards her while reloading and then pumped several more rounds into her
Hmm.
before going inside. And this is the side. I don't know if you want to. This is your field. I don't know if this is sociopathy or psychopathy. Of he then goes inside, asks for a drink of water, like he's some bystander that just happened along, and then basically confesses what he did and can start shouting "Free Palestine."
Yeah, well, yeah, he ultimately just stayed there, talked to the cops like it was, hey, I did this for this reason. Aren't I a good person?
I hadn't even thought of it, but another because I was connecting the stabbing here. This is just like when I brought up uh the the adult, the human adult with a job and a family who ran over that 18-year-old kid
Hmm.
because he was a MAGA extremist. And in his bail hearing, he was talking about how concerned he was about how this was going to ruin his life. I, if I were the judge in that case, I would have been bail denied. You're not right. You No, we're not letting you back out on the streets because you clearly have lost touch with what it is to be human,
Hmm.
to have so little empathy for your fellow man that I can't. It's hard for me to even fathom. Um,
We had in my area, uh, what we have to understand is it sits a, there's like a sweet spot that it sits at, and depending on what is happening in the world at the time, it raises or lowers a little bit. But on average, we have about a 3% psychopathy rate.
mhm.
And it is a kind of a spectrum thing because there's a test, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of the test, but just look up psychopathy test on Google. It probably will pop up. And I scored a 14, which is good. I'm not a psychopath, but I have many other problems, but I'm not a psychopath. But it is it is something. Well, I've talked about the professor studying psychopathy found out he was a psychopath from his
Right.
own research, right? It's something that doesn't show up until it does. It's like color blindness. I don't know I'm colorblind until I took the colorblind test in MEPS, and they were like, "Well, you can't be a pilot." And I'm colorblind. I see colors. I see red here. I'm pointing at something red. I see you're basically neutral color, so I can't. Okay, so the flag. I see red, white, and blue, but apparently I don't. Because if you put any of those colors, well, except for white, if you put red or blue against a gray background that has the same tone, I cannot tell the difference between the two. Same thing with psychopathy. You'll never know until something evident comes out that just says, "Oh, wow, I had this behavior and I felt
Mhm.
nothing." And, and
Hare, HARE, like the rabbit. Hare psychopathy checklist or psychopathy test if you want to take it.
yeah. Uh, actually, the developer of that, he has a great interview on trigonometry. So you could probably do trigonometry, psychopathy, and then that'll probably come up on YouTube.
Interesting.
So yeah, so
All right.
it's a good one. But the thing is, so we have this that exists in society, right? And then you have this person who's semi-radicalized through school, which University of Chicago is one of the better about not doing that. But the whole system,
Hmm.
the society of what is it, osteopaths is what I had.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is corrupted. Uh, look, CrossFit. CrossFit got corrupted after they were taken over by DEI, and now they're dead. Basically, CrossFit is dying a very quick death right now. Uh, which is I'm not too complaining about because they sucked anyways. But uh, so you have this environment. When we found out this guy, his he has a something in his brain that said, okay, this thing that I'm indoctrinated into is more important than those people's lives. and he did the deed, and he went in and is like, nothing's wrong. Nothing's wrong because I did the good thing.
I've referenced this before a couple of times, and I keep forgetting to get the professor's name because, but I don't know if he's a Harvard or a Yale ethics professor who is known for starting classes at the beginning of a semester with a question like, "How many? Raise your hand if you would have stood up and opposed the Nazi regime, if you would
Oh
have
yeah.
stood up and opposed the Holocaust, if you would have stood up and opposed slavery and been an abolitionist." And everyone raises their hands and he says, "Shut up. No, you wouldn't have. Put your hands down." Because history shows that no, you wouldn't have. That I mean, there it is documented of uh you just turn the music up to drown out the screaming.
Hmm.
You just make up a story in your head for what you're smelling coming out of those smokestacks and pretend that it didn't happen. This is why Patton and Ike and others forced the neighboring townspeople to come out and look at the camps, look at the piles of bodies, and then help bury them. No, you look at it. You pretended it didn't happen, even though you knew it was happening. Look at it because it's real.
Which brings me to my first uh, previous research, right? So we have the Ash conformity experiment. And I was having trouble getting a PDF. I thought I had one. I have one saved on my computer somewhere, but I couldn't find it. I need to clean out my folders, but it investigated the degree to which individuals will conform to the opinions of the group, even those opinions are clearly wrong. And the participants were placed in a group. So we're going through Gemini here for those that are just listening. We're placed in a group where most other members were Confederates, which, if anybody doesn't know what a Confederate is if you do an experiment, you can have people that look like participants, but they're actually part of the experiment.
Mm-hmm.
So they're actors, as Gemini says, and they were placed in with the Confederates and instructed to give incorrect answers, who were instructed to give incorrect answers to a simple visual judgment task. And that task was, which line is the same length as the other line? So they would give a line and then they would show like 5 examples. Which one is the same length? The Confederates would pick one that is a different length and they would all pick the same one. And then the person who's actually being experimented on has to pick one. And they were interviewed after, once they were told what, because in a lot of psychological experiments, you have to tell them what you did to them afterwards. And they were interviewed afterwards and they're like, yeah, I wanted to pick the right one, but everybody else was saying this. So I kept second guessing myself, or I didn't want to look like the odd person out, or they gave all kinds of reasons. And so that's conformity, right? So when the Confederates gave incorrect answers, the real participants conformed to their views about 32% of the time, which is actually a very important number because what we see is about 30% of people automatically conform to everything. And I don't know if I would love to see cross-cultural experiments on this, because I think certain societies and civilizations and areas of the world would actually be up or down on that. I think if you did that in Texas, it would be lower. But if you did it in, well, let's stick with it, Germany, it would be higher, but it would average out to that 32%.
Mm.
I think the experiment was done at, I think it was Harvard, so don't quote me on that, but so that would be Massachusetts, which is
Yeah.
typically a little bit more conformist than like South.
Well, you know, disturbingly, it's not just this Massachusetts, but if it was done at Harvard or any of the big Ivy League schools, you're talking about a cross section of the elite of America and the
This one, I
world.
think they did a newspaper ad for the participants.
Okay.
So it
Okay.
wasn't students, which I
Okay.
actually look for when I'm looking at it. Oh, this is another psychological experiment on psychology students. That changes the
Yeah, we've talked
game.
about that before.
Yeah, that changes the game. But a lot of these, like the Milgram experiment, which I'm going to bring up next, was a newspaper ad. that was just basically random Joe Schmoes that showed up
Mhm.
for $100 or whatever to,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I want to read another passage from Starship Troopers, because so when I was looking for what I thought we were going to talk about, um, I was looking for different people's take on not just the book, but specifically the moral philosophy part of it. And I
Let
found,
me put one thought out there
yeah,
before you start that, because I think it's important to what we just talked about, and I think we might go in a different direction after that. I put Pinker up for a reason
mm,
because he wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And his whole point in this extremely long book is we may think that everything is going to hell with our behavior, but actually let's compare it to the past. And over time, we've gotten better and better and better and better and better and better. And the big
mhm.
question is, are things getting worse, or is the internet, smartphones, social media, all of those things just amplifying the signal? Well, I think we're enough into it, into the social media world. What was social media, about 15 years now ish,
Yeah,
if you don't
I
count
would say about
MySpace.
that.
If you
Yeah.
don't count MySpace, which actually those profiles still
Actually,
exist, you
I
can look it
would,
up.
because that's kind of the beta,
Okay, so we'll say 20
version of it.
years. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll say 20 years, but 15 years of smartphone social media. And we can see the trend actually going the other direction again. And that's concerning to me because
Yeah.
I mean Pinker was right.
Well,
L-
more than that, so for anyone who doesn't know the historical context, the phrase comes from Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, which at the time inauguration was in March, not in January like it is now, because it took so long to count votes and all
Mhm.
this. So the secession movement had already started. And in his first inaugural, he is imploring his countrymen, don't do this. Don't tear us apart. And he used the phrase, he appealed to the better angels of our nature, because we have a dark side to us that
Mhm.
we can easily give into.
Jungian shadow self. You know,
And 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 we didn't listen. Enough of us didn't listen anyway.
yeah, hundreds
And
of thousands of people died. Yep.
worse than that, that there has been in the last 10 to 15 years. So for a long time, the number of deaths in the American Civil War was estimated 600 to 650,000, which is, for context, that is more casualties, more deaths than every other American war combined. Well, some more recent scholarship in, like I said, the last 10 to 15-ish years has put that number up to 800,000 and maybe as much as a million,
Mhm.
which for the population at the time is horror. I mean, that's 30 years war territory stuff there, as
Mhm.
far as the death numbers go. So that is what happens when society lets go of the rope and says, "Yeah, let's just go, man," and it does not listen to the better angels, but gives it into that dark side. But speaking of dark side, this is always annoying, but I think it needs to be done because there are
Okay, so
all. No, go ahead.
you said up to a million. So let's do some math here. U.S. population in 1860 was by census 31.5 million.
And that would be fresh because this U.S. census is by constitution every 10 years.
So basically 131.5. So let's do that. One
So, and right
divided
now
by
our
30
population is around 330 billion.
equals, okay, times 330. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 to make millions. That would be the equivalent of 104. No, wait, 1, 2, 3. 10.5 million people dying in a war in our country.
So just wipe out one of the biggest metropolitan, pick one of the top 10 metropolitan areas in the US and wipe it out.
That would be 3 Houstons. I don't know what the population of New York is right, or New York City is right now, or LA, but that would be
Yeah.
3 Houstons, and that's the third biggest city in the country. So
Yep. Yep. That's a lot.
that's a lot.
All right. So, speaking of the darkness, uh, elephant in the room, which I wasn't going to do this, and then I thought, no, I need to because
You don't have to talk about my dick. Okay.
no, I
Sorry,
was
I had
going
to lighten the mood after that last part.
I have to talk about the F word.
Oh,
And not the slang for British cigarette that we're not allowed to say without getting banned. No. Um, one of the problems with talking about Starship Troopers is there are way too many people who think that it is advocating fascism.
hmm.
If you hear anyone say that Heinlein was a fascist, the odds are they never read this book. And if they did, they didn't understand it. And so when I was looking for to see what other people had said about it, I found an interesting blog post from years ago on Gizmodo, which is a tech site. And it was one of their writers did a series called Blogging the Hugos. And the Hugo Award is the award for the best science fiction book. And it started sometime in the 50s. Starship Troopers was one of the first winners of the Hugo Award. So he was reading through every Hugo Award winner and blogging about the books. And I found this entry on Starship Troopers, and I found it very interesting. Um, as an aside, because this is why I have a love-hate relationship with the game Helldivers, because it is clearly parodying the movie. And this is just a snippet about the movie that um I always like to give credit, so let me back up. Josh Wimmer, Starship Troopers is perfect, and therein lies the problem. And so basically his take is he created a utopia, and there's no such thing.
Hmm.
Okay, but we'll get to that in a second. Um, but regarding the controversy around it, he says, although the arguably more famous controversy now, and I think this was written in 2010 or 2012, is whether Paul Verhoeven's 1997 movie adaptation is a horrible, brainless perversion of a thought provoking classic or an ingenious satire that should stand on its own work, or both. And by his own admission, Paul Verhoeven said he only read a couple of pages and he hated it, and then he threw it away. So he doesn't even know what the book is about. But if you want an interesting video of this, Sargon of Akkad, Starship Troopers, go watch his video on it, because he points out that in the prologue, he basically says, by the book, it's not a fascist state. But even by the movie does a terrible job, because even taking it on its own terms, it's not fascism.
Hmm.
So if you want to dig into that, go there, because I just want to touch on it to get the elephant out of the room. Um, and one of the reasons, and I hadn't really thought about this before until I read this article, one of the reasons that a lot of people call it fascist is because it's not very detailed. And you can see this is not a big book. And here's why. Here's from the Gizmodo article. I think it's important to remember that Starship Troopers was supposed to have been the last of Heinlein's, quote, juveniles, his novels aimed at young readers, and to take it with a grain of salt as such. It is thought-provoking, but it's not especially complex, and it's not supposed to be. It's putting an idea out there and offering it up for discussion and expansion upon. And more to the point, I think it's important to remember that the book can also be read, as the good Dr. Lizardo mentioned in the comments of our last installment, as Heinlein, quote, preaching his usual core values of self-reliance, teamwork, not an oxymoron to pair it with self-reliance, accountability, personal freedom, and the golden rule rather than any specific political agenda, end quote. It is a tract, but it's not necessarily pushing what it appears to be. And so keep that in mind whenever I quote from here, whenever I read a passage, is that this is what we would now call a YA, a young adult novel.
Hmm.
So even if it is offering up complex ideas, it is presenting them in a more simple manner than you would if you were picking up, Dostoevsky, which we're going to later.
It's a tough read, by the way.
Oh, goody.
Yeah.
So I want to,
Just the names.
yeah,
You won't
well, there's that.
you won't even attempt to pronounce the Karamas brothers.
Yep.
But yeah, there are it breaks out with more complicated names than that.
Oh,
So
goody.
yeah.
All right. So this is from chapter 8 of Starship Troopers. And to set the context, Johnny Rico, the first person viewpoint that this is written from, and our protagonist has just witnessed an execution, which is a big deal because crime, in again to the Wimmer's point about from that article, it is Heinlein is presenting something of a utopia. And at first blush, it appears to be a utopia until you think deeper, but we'll set that aside for now. And crime is rare in general, but capital crimes are almost unheard of. And someone had kidnapped and then killed a young girl, like an 8-ish-year-old girl. And this is just for someone living in this society, he's having trouble wrapping his brain around why would a human being even do that? I don't understand it. And so this is him thinking. He couldn't sleep that night, and as he says here, I found myself mulling over a discussion in our class in history and moral philosophy. Mr. Du Bois was talking about the disorders that preceded the breakup of the North American Republic back in the 20th century. According to him, there was a time just before they went down the drain when such crimes as Dillinger's were as common as dogfights. The terror had not just been in North America. Russia and the British Isles had it too, as well as other places. But it had reached its peak in North America shortly before things went to pieces. Break here as an aside, a reminder, this was published in 1959.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Okay.
he's referring to W.E.B. Du Bois, right?
No, but I'm guessing that might be one of the inspirations for where he took the name for this teacher.
Mm.
So this is the teacher of the class of history
Oh,
and moral
okay.
philosophy. Um, but I suspect that may have been one of the inspirations for the name.
Mm.
Because even though I don't think Heinlein would have agreed with his philosophy, I think he would have respected him as an intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so Heinlein this is where the greats are great and where the classics are classic, is he is projecting, he is taking the nascent disruptions that we look at the greasers of the 1950s and it's quaint. Okay. But he's looking at this and saying, this is why I talked about the broken window theory. He is looking at this before the broken window theory was established as a theory and saying, if we don't nip this in the bud, this is where we're going. And in the Starship Troopers universe, World War III happens in 1987. Okay, so 30 years from when Heinlein would have been started writing this. But as he says, before we even get to the great disruption and the downfall of society that happened because of World War III, we're already spinning down the drain because we have let things get out of control societally, which is part of what contributes to us getting into World War III in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so back to the book. Law-abiding people, Du Bois had told us, hardly dared go into public park at night. To do so was to risk attack by wolf packs of children, armed with chains, knives, homemade guns, bludgeons, to be hurt at least, robbed most certainly, injured for life probably, or even killed. This went on for years, right up to the war between the Russia-Anglo-American alliance and the Chinese hegemony. Murder, drug addiction, larceny, assault, and vandalism were commonplace. Nor were parks the only places. These things happened also on the streets in daylight, on school grounds, even inside school buildings. But parks were so notoriously unsafe that honest people stayed clear of them after dark. again, an aside, or a park, or say a university campus,
Hmm.
where you would think this should be a safe place of thought and discussion.
Well, this is why I brought up Pinker's work because we've been saying this every generation for forever. Because and we can look at all the movies in the 80s that were Gen X is going to be the gangstas.
Yep.
Everything's going to be punk rock and graffiti and purple, red hair and spikes. And it was going to be RoboCop. But that never happened because Gen X
Mhm.
actually turned out to be quite solid. But the millennials, on the other hand, and Gen Z are turning out to be quite dysfunctional. But there's also this thing in our pockets that we get propaganda 24/7. And I
Mhm.
think that's the difference.
All right, skipping down a little bit. Mr. Du Bois, this is Rico talking. Didn't they have police or courts? They had many more police than we have, and more courts, all overworked. I guess I don't get it. If a boy in our city had done anything half that bad, well, he and his father would have been flogged side by side. But such things just didn't happen. Mr. Du Bois then demanded of me, define a juvenile delinquent. Let me pause there. This is your wheelhouse, Sam. So, Mr. Psychology guy, define juvenile delinquent.
I'm probably going to channel a little Peterson here with someone who wasn't socialized by the age of 4, so they continue to have psychopathic behavior into their young adult years
Mhm.
and add hormones to it, and they're more likely to commit crimes.
That's a good definition, but this is why I wanted to read this section because, and this is why I referenced earlier that we have adult children, and that's really bad, even worse than we thought it was when we
Mhm.
first started, using that term. The failure launch idea initially was just a loser in his basement. No, it's worse than that. It's a trick question,
Mhm.
and that's why I like Heinlein's structure here and the way he presents it in this story rather than as a dry uh academic paper. All right. One of those kids, the ones who used to beat up people. Wrong. Huh? But the book said, my apologies. Your textbook does so state. But calling a tail a leg does not make the name fit. Juvenile delinquent is a contradiction in terms, one which gives a clue to their problem and their failure to solve it. Have you ever raised a puppy? Yes, sir. Did you housebreak him? Yes, sir, eventually. Ah, yes. When your puppy made mistakes, were you angry? What? Why, he didn't know any better. He was just a puppy. What did you do? I scolded him and rubbed his nose in it and paddled him. Surely he could not understand your words. No, but he could tell I was sore at him. But you just said that you were not angry. Mr. Du Bois had an infuriating way of making a person mixed up. No, but I had to make him think I was. He had to learn, didn't he? Conceded. But having made it clear to him that you disproved, how could you be so cruel as to spank him as well? You said the poor beastie didn't know that he was doing wrong, yet you inflicted pain. Justify yourself. Or are you a sadist? I didn't know what a sadist was, but I knew pups. Mr. Du Bois, you have to. You scold him so that he knows he's in trouble. You rub his nose in it so that he'll know what trouble you mean, and you paddle him so he darn well won't do it again. And he goes on with this analogy for a while, which is a good analogy for we're both dog people. We have both raised and trained dogs, both just house dogs as well as I've trained hunting dogs before, and yeah, the, and we've also both raised children. There's a lot of similarity there, which is Heinlein's point here.
Well, I also have the textbook on learning and behavior behind me. This
Ah,
is
yes.
B.F. Skinner and Pavlov and all of those.
Mhm. Right.
Yes.
So skipping down, Mr. Du Bois points out, let's keep that. All right. Let's get back to the juvenile criminals. The most vicious, average, somewhat younger than you are here in this class. And this is a senior class. So you're talking 17, 18-year-old kids, which is true, is that this is why starting in the 80s, many states started to lower the age at which you could be charged as an adult, even before you were technically a legal adult.
Hmm.
and they often started their lawless careers much younger. Let us never forget that puppy. These children were often caught. Police arrested batches each day. Were they scolded? Yes, often scathingly. Were their noses rubbed in it? Rarely. News organs and officials usually kept their names secret. In many places, the law so required for criminals under 18. Were they spanked? Indeed not. Many had never been spanked, even as small children. There was a widespread belief that spanking or any punishment involving pain did a child permanent psychic damage. And then he goes on a long diatribe, basically talking about how Heinlein, through these characters, thinks that's nonsense. And set aside what you think about corporal punishment for children for the time being, because what we're talking about is an escalation of childhood behavior, and we're getting into, as he put it, juvenile delinquents here. And that's the foundation for what we're talking about, whether it is the stabbing at the track meet here in North Texas, or whether it's this shooting by an adult child in DC. You have juvenile delinquents who were never metaphorically spanked. Literally, almost certainly, but certainly,
So
almost
we'll say they were
certainly
never socialized.
You're getting to the root. I'm just talking about how you deal with it. I'm just talking about the broken windows part of it. Of they were never metaphorically spanked through any kind of punishment.
Well, let's bring media into this. Not media as in the news, media as in entertainment. How many years have we had shows where the children are always right and the adults are idiots?
Oh, geez, yeah.
That's the millennial age. That is the design of the show that was presented to the millennial age.
Even in our age, by the 80s and early 90s, the sitcoms, you would frequently have a dad that was silly because it's a sitcom, it's comedy, but he was still a dad.
Roseanne did a good job with the dad.
Yes.
But Home Improvement did a good job with the dad, but that might be the last one. I can't think of anything after that. You remember the old show Dinosaurs? Not the mama. They did a good job with the dad, but of course it was John Goodman too,
I forget that was Goodman. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that show ended too early.
But those are Gen X shows. Those aren't millennial shows. Millennial shows are things like what's the Miley Cyrus show? Hannah Montana?
Yeah.
Yeah, where the kids are always right. The adults are idiots.
Yeah. All right. So skipping ahead a little bit here, because this is getting us to the point, the real point that I want to make. And he talks about the cycle of, as I put it, lack of, a literal or even a metaphorical spanking, a lack of punishment creates a cycle.
I'm going to use the word guidance. A lack of guidance.
Which, back to the puppy analogy, that's what you're doing. When you're trying to housebreak a puppy, you aren't hurting.
Well, people forget that it's not just spanking the dog. It's actually, you give them treats when they do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. As he pointed out, you're just
reward works better than punishment every time. But punishment sometimes is necessary.
For the sake of time, I skipped over the part, but he makes the point through Johnny Rico here that one of the frustrations about housebreaking a dog is you have to catch them. Because if you walk in and find a big turd in the middle of the living room, well, you can't go grab the dog and drag him over here because you have no idea when he did that. And the dog mind, you have to catch them in the act or right afterwards, or they won't understand. This is the problem.
It is one of the keys to behavioral training is immediacy.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so back to the cycle. This incredible sequence could go on for years while his crimes increased in frequency and viciousness, with no punishment whatever, save rare, dull, but comfortable confinements. How many times have we seen this in the past years on college campuses? I just brain farted on her name, the swimmer girl, Riley Gaines.
Riley Gaines, yeah.
was literally held hostage, and the police did nothing. There was a mob holding a young woman and the people around her hostage, and the police were negotiating with and being nicey nice with these criminals rather than bring in the National Guard if you have to and arrest every one of them, charge them, and expel them. Set an example,
Mm-hmm.
not just for them, so that these individuals won't do it again, but when you catch that dog, if you have multiple dogs, then the other dogs go, "Oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want that to happen to me." Which is why it's so much easier to housebreak a dog if you have an older already housebroken dog, because it will set the example. Um, then suddenly, usually by law on his 18th birthday, this so-called juvenile delinquent, keep that in mind because that's really the point. Like I said, it's a trick question, becomes an adult criminal
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes wound up in only weeks or months in a death cell awaiting execution for murder. He had singled me out again. Suppose you merely scolded your puppy, never punished him, let him go on making messes in his house, and occasionally locked him up in an outbuilding, but soon let him back into the house with a warning not to do it again. Then one day you notice he is now a grown dog and still not housebroken, whereupon you whip out a gun and shoot him dead. Comment, please. Why, that's the craziest way to raise a dog I ever heard of. I agree. Or a child. Whose fault would it be? Why, mine, I guess. Again, I agree, but I'm not guessing. Mr. Du Bois, the girl blurted out, but why? Why didn't they spank little kids when they needed it and use a good dose of the strap on any older ones who deserved it? The sort of lesson they wouldn't forget. I mean, ones who did really bad things. Why not? I don't know, he answered grimly, except that the time tested methods of instilling social virtue and respect for law in the minds of the young did not appeal to the pre scientific pseudo professional class who called themselves social workers or sometimes child psychologists. Again, this was written in 1950.
Oh my goodness. If he'd only known.
If he'd only known,
Or
I,
what we call social emotional learning.
yeah, I believe Heinlein died in the late 80s. So
Yeah.
yeah, if he'd
Okay, so
only
he would have been
known.
at the beginning of emotional learning. So, but he
Yeah.
probably was already checked out. So,
Yep. 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 Um, so skipping down here some more. He has us back and forth with this young lady. No, my no, my dear. Wait, back up. Uh, they did have a theory of morals, and they tried to live by it. I should not have sneered at their motives, but their theory was wrong. Half of it fuzzy-headed wishful thinking, half of it rationalized charlatan. That's a hard word to say. Charlatanry. The more earnest they.
almost as hard as ostracization.
Yep, there you go.
I can't. I don't know why I cannot say that word. I need it for my industry so much.
The more earnest they were, the farther it led them astray. Doesn't that sound familiar with this specific topic that we started with today? You see, they assumed that man has a moral instinct. Now, some of what I'm about to get into here, put a pin in because I want to dive deeper into this next time. Today, I just want to talk about what happens when we just. What I'd originally wanted to talk about was this idea of, does man have a moral instinct? Yes or no? If so, what is it? If not, how do we establish it? Instead, what I want to talk about first is why it frickin' matters, which is what this is all about. Sir, I thought, but he does. I have. No, my dear, you have a cultivated conscience, a most carefully trained one. Man has no moral instinct. He is not born with moral sense. You were not born with it. I was not. And a puppy has none. We acquire moral sense when we do through training experience, and hard sweat of the mind. These unfortunate juvenile criminals were born with none, even as you and I, and they had no chance to acquire any. Their experiences did not permit it. It is what is moral sense? It is an elaboration of the instinct to survive. The instinct to survive is human nature itself, and every aspect of our personalities derives from it. Anything that conflicts with the survival instinct acts sooner or later to eliminate the individual and thereby fails to show up in future generations. The truth is mathematically demonstrable, everywhere verifiable. It is the single internal imperative controlling everything we do.
The thing I want to be careful of here is that's a very blank slate uh observation, and we do have ranges of emotional capacity, especially with things like empathy, because I mean that's why psychopaths exist, because their range is zero. But most people are somewhere in the middle of the bell curve, and as a social animal, we can that's the definition of empathy, is that you can feel what other people are feeling. And when you can feel someone else's pain, your threshold for bad behavior is lowered. And oh, shoot, I might have to grab the book real quick to quote it, but there's a balancing act that takes place, and it's between socialization and the natural empathy we have within ourselves.
Well, that's a good point to segue me to where I want to go, because I'm going to skip the next couple of pages and we'll come back to it later when I want to talk more about moral philosophy and where it comes from and how we get it. And I want to jump to the punchline, which is where he finally gets back to the term juvenile delinquent and why it was a trick question.
Okay,
So
let me pause this real quick. All right, sorry for the hiccup there. Even though we're pulling it to a close, we needed bathroom breaks. So do you want to go into yours first, or?
yeah, so let me give you Heinlein's answer to the trick question of juvenile delinquent here, which will then segue into you found the passage you were thinking of there. Mr. Boys then turned to me. I told you that juvenile delinquent is a contradiction in terms. Delinquent means failing in duty, but duty is an adult virtue. Indeed, a juvenile becomes an adult when and only when he acquires a knowledge of duty and embraces it as dearer than the self-love he was born with. There never was, there cannot be a juvenile delinquent. But for every juvenile criminal, there are always one or more adult delinquents, people of mature years who either do not know their duty or who, knowing it, fail. And that was the soft spot which destroyed what was in many ways an admirable culture. The junior hoodlums who roamed their streets were symptoms of a greater sickness. Their citizens, all of them counted as such, glorified their mythology of rights and lost track of their duties. No nation so constituted can endure. I will add to, again, back to this specific example that started us here. One of the things that I have seen reported from a number of outlets is that the father of this shooter was the guest, one of the guests of the Democrats in Trump's not State of the Union speech earlier in the year.
Really? I did not see that. Is that true?
I
That's a heck of a connection if it's true.
I saw it reported on several different outlets at several different outlets that I trust.
I think I need time to let that marinate. But yeah, but you're right. And this is one of the problems. This is the hard thing about parenting is, especially with your first child, you don't know anything. You have some guidance from your parents as you were raised. You've got maybe some books you could read, you know, You've got you got a little bit out there, the internet, which sucks. Uh, but you don't know what you're doing, and you kind of learn as you go. And some of it is instinctual, and so that's good. But not everybody's made for it, and we have a lot of cognitive dissonance, or not a lot of denial, cognitive. Uh, yeah, I'll use the word denial. We have a lot of that because how many of these serial killers that grew up when their parents were later interviewed, they're like, yeah, he used to torture puppies, but we thought we could, and they held it in. They didn't get him
Mhm.
help. They were embarrassed. So their own embarrassment affected the way they parented their child because they needed to get help a lot sooner, right? Uh,
Well, this I think connects to which was the Ash one, the 32% that
mhm,
will just go along is this is where I think we have compounded our nature, the not the better angels of our nature, but the demons of our nature, rather than finding ways to work around them, finding ways to minimize our negativity and maximize our positivity, because we are already inclined in that direction. And now you add on top of that this idea of my truth.
mm.
And so for years now, it has been a growing taboo to tell someone they're wrong. I'm sorry, some things are just wrong. And
Well,
now
again, I keep parsing your terms, but some things are just socially unacceptable.
that is an important distinction because, obviously
Well, survival is
killing
right.
someone is, yeah,
Survival is right, but you don't need to kill somebody to survive in modern society. So that's if someone's attacking you, you have the right to defend yourself. So the act
but
of killing somebody isn't the evil thing. The why you did it is the evil thing.
here's a very seemingly dumb analogy, but I think it matters because it's back to the broken windows. In part of my running around, I restocked the bar. One of the things that drives me absolutely bonkers about uh the liquor store I go to is they have, and other stores do this too, but because of the lack of parking here, it's more egregious. They have like 8 spaces reserved for online order pickup. Every time I go there, at least half of those spots are full of empty cars. People who just parked there. They just parked there because it's close and they're just going to go inside. And they didn't want the hassle of having to walk a little extra. That isn't wrong in the sense that I was using, but to your point, that is socially unacceptable
Hmm.
because you're being a selfish prick. And back to the broken windows theory is no, what are you doing? If you're in the passenger seat, you know, uh, when you were up here helping me repair my fence,
Hmm.
and I went there to restock and get some stuff, and you're sitting in the passenger seat and I do that, it would be incumbent on you to say, hey, Hole, what are you doing?
Hmm.
Don't what No, go park over there. We can walk, right? Because this is socially unacceptable. And if you don't nip it in the bud, what's the next escalation? And then what's the escalation beyond that? And what's the escalation beyond that?
And that's the tough part of the Dunbar number, right? Because say you are one of my five actually. So say you're one of my five, and I want to keep my relationship with you good,
Mm,
but also have to think about the greater society. You want to park there, and I need to speak up because that's the right thing to do. But also, I'm trying to keep my relationship with you
yeah.
intact. And so, where's the balance there? And so, but you're right that we do need, no, this is the right thing to do, and I need that person to know it,
Mhm.
which is a hard thing to do. I do it every day for a living because I have to nip bad habits in the butt when I have a client that has one because that's my job.
Mhm.
But I have personal relationships with these clients and I need their money and I don't need them to walk out the door and all of those things too. So it's like, which ones do I speak up about? Which one's going to offend them? Which one is, and I've chosen the truth route and it's actually ended up badly, poorly sometimes, which to me, that's on them. But at the same time, is it really on them? Did I pick a bad battle to fight? You know, that kind of those thoughts always go through your head.
Mhm.
So it is a very complicated thing. But with your children, especially at a very young age, at a very young age, you know they know nothing. They know what I they know what they want. That's
Literally,
all they
yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And you have to balance what they want with what they need in a way that teaches them to want what they need.
We always try and find a thing of, hey, comment below. And that's a good one for this episode is if you have any insight, if you have any experience of how do you tell a friend, close friend, or just a friend, hey, no, don't, that's wrong. Don't do that. Why are you doing that?
Mhm.
If you have a technique, if you have experience, positive or negative, you know, let us, not just me and Sam, but let everyone watching this know, hey, this is how I do it. This is how I've learned to approach these subjects. Because to your point, it is important, but it can be scary. Of is this the right battle to fight? How do I say this without alienating this person?
Well, and I'm also balancing my needs too.
Mhm.
So we'll do the parenting thing. One of the things that I struggle with my child is he's very much addicted to gaming, uh, computer gaming. You take him away from that, and he stops functioning. He's like a robot that's twitching with, because you threw water on it, that kind of thing. But when we were raising him at a very young age, we had an individual in med school and me running a business, and that iPad came in handy sometimes. And I think we overdid it.
Mhm.
But I look back and I'm like, how could I have done it differently? There wasn't much opportunity to do it differently, or we would have not been able to eat. So it's like, okay, so I've got to counter this thing we did when he was a young child. Okay, so he has this behavior that I don't like, and I did it to him, and I take that responsibility. So I have to figure out how to help him now. And that's what most parents refuse to do. They say, oh, well, you can't blame everything on me because he's his own self. He's an individual, just like the juvenile delinquent.
Mhm.
They're an individual, and parents refuse to take the responsibility of their own raising of the child. There is genetics involved, but again, everything's a range. And actually, also, you're 50% of their genetics. So take responsibility for that too. And actually, this is a great thing. This is a good point, I think, that just popped up. Know your limitations, and
Mm.
you'll know half of your children's limitations.
That's a good point too. Yeah, I've talked about this before about how often I bite my tongue now versus 10, 15 years ago when I was online on social media way too much, and I would anything that triggered a thought, I would comment on it. And
Which
it didn't
unfortunately for
help.
us, that's what monetizes.
I know, but it didn't help. It
Yeah.
actually made things worse. And now, I you can't bottle it up, but I also go, is this worth talking about? Is this going to have any sort of impact? Am I adding anything to the discussion, or am I just adding to the noise? All right. So to your point, you had a passage from something you wanted to read to add to
Well, I
this.
kind of want to end
Close
with
this
it,
out.
so you can do your final thoughts if you want.
Those were my final thoughts.
Okay, so what I'm balancing here, and it's kind of we strayed a little bit from the original topic, but is there is a balance of the self and the society that has to take place. And this really hit me, and it's about empathy. It's from chapter 4 of The Age of Empathy by one of my intellectual heroes, Franz de Waal, which when we talk our where does morality come from, there are literally books written on this. So The Moral Animal is another one right above me. But it's actually a quote of Martin Hoffman, 1980, gosh, old man eyes, 1981. And he uses that quote to open that chapter. Empathy may be uniquely well suited for bridging the gap between egoism and altruism, since it has the property of transforming another person's misfortune into your own feelings of distress. So obviously, this man lacked that, at least in
Yeah.
this situation. but he may have had it for this abstract cause that was force fed into him and indoctrinated into him. And I didn't get to go into the work of Chase Hughes that I had pulled up on the four horsemen of a psyop, and which we're definitely seeing right now. But what's the word he uses?
Well,
Indoctrinate. Yeah, the four horsemen of a psyop are ideas, ideology, identity, and indoctrination. And when you combine that with our ability to create our own identity, our own ego, he used the word ego in that quote, with a cause, then you don't even have to be a psychopath to take steps and feel perfectly fine about what you do. It's combining those things. Uh, it's combining the insular response of disgust. He was disgusted with the behavior of Israel in general, and he took it out on these two people. Because what do you do when you put something in your mouth that is disgusting?
mm,
You spit it out and you throw it in the trash. You get rid of it. You eliminate it from your life, period. And you never want to touch it again. And that's where he was. And his indoctrination, as I brought up with the mission statement of the society he was involved in, the schooling he had. This is why college is so effed up right now.
mm.
And again, University of Chicago is one of the best about not doing that, and it's still there.
Or one of the not nearly as bad as everyone else's.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
least worst. Yeah. The best is University of Austin, the new University of Austin. But
Well, and some of the depressing coverage of this incident has been the whitewashing of it, the downplaying of it. To me, that's worse than there are people celebrating it, and that's heinous. But
and I had
to
up
me, the
also the
whitewashing
Mangione
is
effect.
worse. Yeah,
The
yeah.
Mangione. This is actually I would say I'd give it 99%, because you can't 100% anything, but 99% downstream of the Mangione effect.
Mm.
This
Which
per
to remind people, that is the guy who shot was it United
C
Healthcare?
United Healthcare CEO,
The
yeah,
United Healthcare CEO.
and
It
he's
was
been
caught on
celebrated,
video,
yeah.
and because he's good looking, people on the internet lost their minds, and because of ideology, people on the internet lost their minds. And I'm sitting here going, whatever you think about the guy, a human being is dead, and
Hmm.
you're celebrating it, and it's not like, this isn't like we got him, finally capturing Osama bin Laden
Well,
or
it's
killing
celebrating
Osama
the
bin Laden. This
idea
is
is the problem. That
yes,
violence solved it.
yes. Well, this
It,
the four horsemen there is,
hmm
yeah, it's the ideology.
hmm
Mhm. Ugh. Well, that is why. I mean, that is why we started where we started and ended up where we ended up, because the idea here is, how do you keep it from happening? This is why these kinds of things matter. This is why I think people like Chris Williamson have developed huge platforms. Rogan, Jordan Peterson, have been able to, the positives of social media and YouTube, for all the negatives that we can talk about. This is the positives of it, is that these people would not have been able to reach an audience without these platforms. And there are clearly a lot of people hungry for answers to these questions that are
hmm
not being addressed elsewhere. And that's why we have come into this space, even if we only have a handful of people watching. You know what? It's better than nothing, and hopefully even our handful of people touch a handful of people that, and exponentially grow.
Well, and if you made it this far and you got here from there, hit that subscribe. I uh, Angela McArdle, who was the chair of the Libertarian Party, posted the other day, said, if you have a podcast, put your link below. And I threw it down there with a little description of what we are. If you came from there, hit the subscribe. give us a like, please. And if you hated it, tell us why. Of course, if you hated it, you probably didn't make it this far. Yeah, we're just two guys yelling at the clouds. But I think we're pretty sharp, theoretically. I mean,
Hmm.
uh, we read
I
a
mean,
lot, at least.
te te technically, I have a well above average IQ, so if you want to go
Yeah.
on that, sure.
And I make all A's in school, so that's at least a measure. It's not the measure, but it is a measure. And stick with us. We'll be back with a Wheel of Time after this, and we'll be wearing the same clothes because we're filming these back to back, even though I will put them up at separate times.
All right, see
All
you
right,
next time.
next time.